The transatlantic slave trade stands as one of the darkest chapters in human history. For over 4 centuries, from the 16th to the 19th centuries, this brutal trade persisted. Millions of Africans were forcibly transported across the Atlantic Ocean. Torn from their homes and families, they faced unimaginable horrors. Enduring brutal conditions on ships, they were treated as mere cargo. Upon arrival in the Americas, they were sold into slavery. European powers like Portugal, Spain, England, France, and the Netherlands orchestrated this trade. Their colonies in the Americas demanded labor for vast plantations. Crops like sugar, tobacco, and cotton became highly profitable. The insatiable demand for enslaved Africans grew. This demand fueled a system of exploitation and cruelty. Africans were dehumanized, treated as commodities. Bought, sold, and traded like objects, their humanity was stripped away. The transatlantic slave trade left an indelible mark on the world. It reshaped societies, economies, and cultures on both sides of the Atlantic. This essay will delve into the harrowing history of the transatlantic slave trade. We will uncover the experiences of those who lived through it. We will examine the trade's profound impact on African, American, and European societies. Finally, we will reflect on the long-term consequences of this horrific period. Who were the people who profited from this inhumane trade? They were European merchants and ship owners driven by greed. They saw enslaved Africans as cargo to be transported for maximum profit. Companies like the Royal African Company were established specifically for this purpose. They obtained charters from their governments, giving them monopolies over certain regions of Africa. These companies built and outfitted ships specifically designed for transporting human beings. These vessels, known as slave ships, were often overcrowded and unsanitary. The conditions on board were deplorable, with disease, malnutrition, and death rampant. The merchants and captains of these ships showed little regard for the suffering of those they transported. These individuals argued that Africans were inferior. They used this belief to justify their actions. They claimed to be bringing civilization to Africa through Christianity. However, their true motives were economic gain and power. The merchants of the transatlantic slave trade amassed immense wealth. This wealth came at the cost of millions of African lives and the destruction of countless families and communities. Born in what is now Nigeria, Ola Eano was kidnapped and sold into slavery as a child. He was transported to the Americas, where he endured the horrors of plantation life. Eano eventually gained his freedom and became a vocal abolitionist. His autobiography, published in 1789, provided a first-hand account of the transatlantic slave trade's brutality. Equiano's eloquent writing and powerful storytelling gave a voice to the voiceless. He challenged the racist assumptions of his time. He exposed the hypocrisy of those who claimed to be civilized while perpetuating such a barbaric system. Equiano's story is just one of millions. It is a reminder of the resilience and strength of the human spirit in the face of unimaginable adversity. His voice helped to galvanize the abolitionist movement in both Europe and America. The Middle Passage was the most horrific leg of the transatlantic slave trade. It was the journey across the Atlantic Ocean from Africa to the Americas. Enslaved Africans were crammed into the holds of ships. They were chained together in cramped, unsanitary conditions. The journey could last anywhere from 6 weeks to 3 months. Disease was rampant. Many Africans succumbed to dysentery, smallpox, and other illnesses. Those who died on board were thrown overboard. The conditions were so horrific that some Africans chose to take their own lives rather than endure further suffering. The Middle Passage was a traumatic experience for those who survived. They arrived in the Americas physically and emotionally scarred. They were then sold into a life of forced labor, separated from their families and stripped of their dignity. Section 5. Resistance, the unquenchable flame of freedom. Despite the horrors they faced, Africans never stopped resisting their enslavement. Resistance took many forms. On slave ships, Africans revolted against their captors. They fought back with whatever they could find. These revolts were often unsuccessful. However, they demonstrated the enslaved Africans' determination to be free. On plantations, Africans found ways to sabotage their work. They ran away, seeking refuge in maroon communities. These communities were formed by escaped slaves. They offered a glimpse of freedom and self-determination. These acts of resistance, both large and small, were a testament to the indomitable spirit of the African people. Section 6. African societies torn apart and transformed. The transatlantic slave trade had a devastating impact on African societies. The loss of millions of people, primarily young and able-bodied men and women, weakened communities. It disrupted social structures and economic development. The slave trade created a climate of fear and instability. Some African rulers participated in the slave trade. They traded captives of war or criminals for European goods, including guns and ammunition. This participation further fueled conflict and instability on the continent. The transatlantic slave trade left a deep scar on the African psyche. It continues to shape perceptions of race, identity, and power dynamics today. Section 7. The Americas, built on forced labor. The transatlantic slave trade played a pivotal role in the development of the Americas. The forced labor of millions of Africans fueled the growth of colonial economies. It provided the foundation for the wealth and prosperity of European empires. In the Caribbean, enslaved Africans worked on sugar plantations. These plantations produced immense profits for European slaveholders. In the American South, enslaved Africans cultivated tobacco, cotton, and other crops. These crops were exported to Europe, enriching slaveholders and fueling industrial growth. The legacy of slavery continues to haunt the Americas. Section 8. Europe's prosperity, a blood-stained legacy. While the transatlantic slave trade brought immense suffering to Africa and the Americas, it also had a profound impact on Europe. The wealth generated by the slave trade fueled Europe's economic expansion. It contributed to the rise of industrial capitalism. European cities, ports, and industries flourished as a result of the trade in enslaved Africans and the goods produced by their labor. However, this prosperity came at a heavy moral cost. European societies became complicit in the enslavement and exploitation of millions of people. The legacy of slavery continues to shape European attitudes towards race, colonialism, and global inequality. Section 9. The Abolitionists fighting for humanity. By the 18th century, a growing movement against slavery began to emerge. Abolitionists, driven by moral outrage and a belief in the inherent equality of all human beings, condemned the transatlantic slave trade as a crime against humanity. They organized campaigns, wrote pamphlets, and lobbied governments to end the trade. In Britain, figures like William Wilberforce and Thomas Clarkson dedicated their lives to fighting for abolition. They exposed the horrors of the slave trade. They appealed to the conscience of the British public. In the United States, abolitionists like Frederick Douglass and Harriet Tubman risked their lives to help slaves escape to freedom. The abolitionist movement faced fierce opposition from those who profited from slavery. However, their tireless efforts eventually led to the abolition of the transatlantic slave trade in Britain and the United States in the 19th century. Section 10. The end of a nightmare, the scars that remain. The abolition of the transatlantic slave trade was a major victory for human rights. However, it did not end the practice of slavery. In the United States, the Civil War from 1861 to 1865 was fought over the issue of slavery. The Union victory led to the abolition of slavery in the country. Brazil was the last country in the Americas to abolish slavery in 1888. The legacy of the transatlantic slave trade continues to shape the world today. The economic, social, and cultural disparities between nations can be traced back to this period. The psychological scars of slavery continue to affect descendants of enslaved Africans. Section 11. Remembering the past, shaping the future. It is essential to remember the transatlantic slave trade and its victims. We must learn from this dark chapter in human history. We must work to create a more just and equitable world. By acknowledging the past, we can work towards a future where all people are treated with dignity and respect. The transatlantic slave trade was a horrific tragedy. It is a reminder of the capacity for cruelty that exists within humanity. However, it is also a testament to the resilience, strength, and determination of the human spirit to overcome adversity.